I am Dr. Ray Dykes, and this is the Personal Faith Program. This is a podcast about the books of the New Testament in chronological order. This podcast represents, and I'm going to try to give you an educated guess as to when the books of the New Testament were first put in written form, even though that form may not have been the form we have today. For instance, there's considerable support for the theory that all four of the Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, in chronological order, were in liquid form for several decades and were not frozen in their present form until well into the 2nd century and possibly until the year 300. Now, this listing I'm going to give you also represents the most modern scholarship and educated guesses as to who wrote and who didn't write these books in their original forms. All right, the first book in the New Testament that was written in 51, and that's First Thessalonians. First Thessalonians was written in 51 by Paul. That's the first book in the New Testament written. The second is Galatians, written by Paul in approximately 54 to the churches of Galatia, a region of present-day Turkey. Thessalonica, by the way, is in northern Greece. The third book written in the New Testament is Paul's first letter to Corinth, 1 Corinthians, also written in about 54. This Corinth in Greece. The fourth book written is 2 Corinthians, also written by Paul, in around 55. Now, there's a little problem with 2 Corinthians because it appears that there are maybe 2 or 3 letters that have been joined together in 2 Corinthians, and we're not sure maybe when all that was written. The next book written next letter written is Philippians, when Paul writes to Philippi, another church in northern Greece, and that's in 56. He writes that in 56. Next is his great summary of his theology that he writes in 58, when he writes to the church in Rome, where he had never been before. Church he didn't start, church he has only had correspondence with. The last letter that Paul wrote himself was the tiny letter called Philemon, in which he's writing about a slave and how to treat that slave. Very little theology in there. It's just a personal letter, but it made it in because everyone knew Paul wrote that. The next letter written is Colossians, and this was written in 62. Paul was still alive. He was beheaded in 64. He's still alive in 62. He's under house arrest in Rome. And the vocabulary, the Greek vocabulary in Colossians does not match Paul's vocabulary, but it is possible that Paul dictated this letter to the Colossians, and he had a scribe. Even though Paul, of course, was very linguistic and able to write himself, very literate, he perhaps was dictating this to a scribe who writes with his own vocabulary rather than word for word what Paul said. Colossians, it's very much got Paul's theology in it, but different vocabulary. 2 Thessalonians, also 62, while Paul was in house arrest in Rome. Same thing. Probably the vocabulary of a scribe. Then we get to the Gospels. Now we get to the Gospels. First Gospel written is the Gospel dedicated to Mark, and it's written in Rome. It's written by the Church of Rome, a scribe in the Church of Rome. It's the Roman Church's Gospel, written in between 68 and 70, in a very tumultuous time in Rome. The Gospel of Mark, first Gospel. Second Gospel, Gospel of Matthew, written around 75, written by the church in Alexandria, Egypt. they had a copy of Mark as they wrote the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel dedicated to Matthew. The next letter written is the letter to Ephesus, the Ephesian letter, and written by a disciple of Paul in 80, approximately 16 years after Paul was beheaded in 64. Then we got the third gospel, the Gospel of Luke. And the gospel dedicated to Luke is written by the church in Antioch of Syria, and is written around 80 with copies of Mark and Matthew at hand in the writing of this process, in the process of writing the gospel dedicated to Luke. The book called the Acts of the Apostles was written a couple of years later, 82, also by the church of Antioch. This is Luke Acts is actually a 2-volume set. Then the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John written in 90 by the church in Ephesus, western Turkey, Ephesus Miletus. 2 towns there close together with a strong Christian community. The Gospel of John, dedicated to John, written there. 1 Peter was written, a letter called 1 Peter, written in 91 by an admirer of Peter. Peter's long been dead in 91. Hebrews written in the letter to the Hebrews, written in 93, and we have no idea who wrote that. No one has ever even speculated who wrote the letter to the Hebrews. At one time, a few people thought Paul had written that, but that's been discounted long, long ago. The next book written was in 95, and that was the Apocalypse of John, so-called the Revelation. And that was also written by the church of Ephesus Miletus. The Gospel of John, the Apocalypse of John, and the letters of John are called the Johannine literature in the New Testament. So 95 is approximately when the Apocalypse of John, or the book of Revelation, was written. The letter of James, 97, written by an admirer of James. We don't know which James this is. There were lots of James. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, all written around 100, 3 letters, and a great deal about love in these 3 letters. Johannine literature, written by the church of Ephesus Miletus. Again, 1st and 2nd Timothy, often claimed to have been written by Paul, but no, it was written around 110. These 2 letters written around 110 by an admirer of Paul, who is trying to carry on Paul's ideas, some of them very different. So the theology is different, and the vocabulary is different. Titus also in that same group. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, all 3 written by an admirer of Paul. Jude, by an admirer of Jude. Now again, we don't know which Jude this is. Jesus had a brother named Jude, written around 115. And then 2 Peter is the last book written in the New Testament around 130 by an admirer of Peter. The latest, and then that was the end of it. The list of books in the New Testament was finally kind of consolidated around 350 when in a letter that the bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, sent out a festal letter in which he lists these 27 books and said these are the books that Christians should read. So that's a little thumbnail sketch of the chronology of the books of the New Testament. See you next time.